On this music-filled Friday, we welcome Jacob Johnson, who is getting ready to play Fall for Greenville tonight. Now, he's got to wait a couple weeks.
Yeah. Well, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to make the rescheduled dates because I'm on the road in a different part of the country.
Hey, at least
y'all will have to try to carry on without me.
Well, I guess we'll get our own little Fall for Greenville right now,
exactly.
today, because it works out because you also have a big album release, Surviving the Dream.
Surviving the Dream. That's what we're all trying to. We're living the dream. Sometimes we're just surviving the dream.
Yes.
So that's out today. It's all songs about being on the road and travel and distance and things like that.
What is it like being on the road? Because it sounds like glamorous, but after a while, does it ever get like...
I love it. I love being in the car. I love driving. I love the solitude. I love the scenery. I mean, it can get old after a little while, but on the whole, like because I haven't been on the road maybe a month or two, and I like and really get antsy, and I miss it, and I don't know like what to do with myself.
Yes.
You know.
Well, tell me, like, what's your favorite thing about performing live and doing all the shows? You know,
I love entertaining people. I'm not an artiste. I'm not here to like preach at people or try to get some deeper message across. All that stuff's fine, but at the end of the day, it's tough out there, and sometimes people just need to be entertained.
They just want to be entertained.
Yeah, and that's what I'm here to do.
And you're teaching as well?
Yeah, I'm adjunct up at North Greenville University, which is the college I dropped out of. Thank you very much.
It's all full circle.
Our side. But I'm also back in school. I'm doing Berkeley online, so I'm going to have a guitar degree by the time I'm 40, hopefully.
Look at you! Look at you!
Surviving the dream.
We'll add that to a chapter. What song are you going to play for us today?
So this is a song called the Goodnight Chorus.
Okay.
I wrote this song with a buddy of mine named Gray Lee. How's it going, Gray? I miss you, buddy. And we sort of wrote, every act needs like that closing down the bar into the night kind of song. So this is the earliest in the morning that I've ever played it.
Okay.
But yeah, this is the Goodnight Chorus. But it doesn't have a chorus. It's just a bunch of verses like a Bob Dylan song.
I love it. Hey, that's what we're here for. Y'all give it up to Jacob Johnson. You can find all of his information at your screen. Surviving the Dream.
Good night to the waitress and the regular crowd. Good night to the band that's playing too loud. Good night, good night, good night to you all. Good night. Good night to the ladies. Good night to the gents. Good night, you go-getters that got up and went. Good night, good night, good night to you all. Good night. Good night to the gypsies, the weary, the worried. Good night to the tipsy, the drowsy, the blurry. Good night, good night, good night to you all. Good night. Good night to the cowboys and the rodeo clowns, to the salt of the earth and the dust to the ground. Good night, good night, good night to you all. Good night. Good night, your street preacher reading from King James Dean. Good night, all your pushers and alleyway queens. Good night, good night, good night to you all. Good night. Good night to the voice of a lost generation, singing for tips in a dark railway station. Good night, good night, good night to you all. Good night. Good night, you ambitious, too big for this town. Come back when you're ready to lay some roots down. Good night to the hustlers, to the wise guys and thieves. Good night, all you skeptics and those who believe. Good night to the late crowd. Good night, early risers. Good night, all you poets. Good night, plagiarizers. Good night to the faithful. Good night to the few. Good night, all you lovers and the ones that love you. Good night, good night, good night. To you all, good night. Good night, good night, good night. To you all, good night.